It's great to be here, and I really want to thank VIDO for putting this on. This is a passion of mine, FMD, and since I joined the agency about 13 years ago, I've spent most of my time working on FMD control programs, and we've seen a lot of encouraging signs from industry looking at the use of vaccination, and we've been able to change some thinking around the world through WOA as well. One of the things I wanted to talk about is that just to make sure everybody understands that foot and mouth disease is an official status disease. Well, what does that mean at WOA? That means that as soon as we get one case anywhere in Canada, whether it's in PEI or in Alberta, the whole country is classified as infected. Your country shuts down for trade, and it becomes a real problem. And the other thing with WOA and official status is that the Scientific Commission at WOA will make all the decisions regarding your zoning requests, your recovery of freedom, and so we will have to end up submitting a dossier to WOA at the end of an outbreak or when we decide we will create a zone in order for them to approve it, and then we will be able to begin trade again. So it's very, very different from AI, avian influenza, or from ASF, which are not official status diseases, and we can self-declare our own freedom. So today I wanted to just talk a little bit, discuss some information on our current thoughts on the use of emergency vaccination in Canada. A lot of those thoughts are going to echo what both Gordon and Brian have talked about. And then I want to talk about some of the changes to the FMD chapter over time and how some of the work that Canada's been doing to influence those changes at WOA and how that's progressing in order to allow Vaccinate to Live. I think it's important to really put into perspective that our goal at CFI in any FMD outbreak is to return, the desired outcome is to reestablish FMD freedom without vaccination for either a portion of the country or all of the country as quickly as possible. And our response strategy may need to change over time, depending on the way the outbreak is proceeding, and it may not be applied equally over the whole of the country. Okay, our response in Atlantic Canada may not be the same as our response in Feedlot Alley. The basic principles of eradicating any disease: eradicate the sources of the disease agent through a stamping out policy, and WOA describes stamping out as an infected animal plus a suspected of infected animal. So people have taken that to mean that you have to depopulate the whole herd, the whole premise. Prevent contact between susceptible animals and the disease agent through movement controls. And, you know, as Gordon was talking about movement controls, CFIA does not have the authority in our Health of Animals Act to impose movement controls until we establish a primary control zone. So we're trying to work with industry through Animal Health Canada to look at the ways that we can have a voluntary movement standstill. We want to increase the resistance of susceptible animals to the disease agent, and that's where emergency vaccination comes in. And we want to contain the disease to a geographic area through zoning. And one of the things that you have to remember is this is not COVID. People, you know, especially even in CFIA, talk about, well, you know, we've got to vaccinate a certain percentage of the population. No, that's not what we're doing. We're trying to suppress the virus by only vaccinating a few animals in small areas, because the more animals we vaccinate, the harder it is to recover our freedom at the end of the outbreak. Canada had always thought that vaccination would be used as a measure of last resort, and that was the rationale behind the establishment of the North American Foot and Mouth Vaccine Bank back in 1982. And I remember the green-hatted fellow that established that, Eugene Wayland, was a member of, I think, the Liberal government at the time. The experiences of Japan and South Korea in 2010 during their outbreaks caused our Quad's partners, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and US, to reevaluate our position on vaccination in a response. The Quad's CVOs, or the Chief Veterinary Officers, first asked the Quad's modeling task group to look at how and when vaccination might be used. because there had been no real thought about how that vaccine was going to be deployed. Secondly, the CVOs tasked Canada with leading a group of international FMD experts to develop justification for harmonizing waiting periods to recover freedom with a vaccinate to live and vaccinate to kill. And part of that issue was with the delays to depopulation. And this is a graph of the number of animals waiting for depop in Japan. And on average, it was taking them about 11 days to depop. Okay? And it began to increase until they had close to 68,000 animals waiting for depopulation at 11 days. And that is a huge source of virus in the environment, just to contaminate the area. And a lot of these were pigs, so they were generating massive aerosolization of this virus, causing increased spread. And until they started vaccinating in May of 22nd, after that they began to see the fall of these animals waiting for depop. And so that got us thinking that any time that there's delays to depopulation, we've got to think about how we can conserve our time if our resources are stretched. So the principal impediment to the use of emergency vaccination has always been the extended waiting periods that follows the earliest restoration of status and the ability to resume trade or exports. Our current vaccinate to live policies present a significant economic disincentive just because of the doubling of that waiting period that you have to before you can recover your freedom. But as was said by both Brian and Gordon, we know that these higher potency vaccines that we're looking at confer protective immunity and reduce virus shedding in all target species within about 4 days. So the modeling done by the Quads countries has shown that a 3-kilometer vaccination zone controls the outbreaks while minimizing the number of animals that we're vaccinating. And it doesn't really seem to matter how the vaccination was deployed, inside out, outside in, high-risk premises, as long as it was done quickly. Okay? If used early, vaccination can reduce the length of the outbreak and the number of cases by about half in large outbreaks. But as I think it was Brian that said, but vaccination may actually prolong small outbreaks due to the increased time and the increased amount of testing that has to be done at the end of it in order to fill your dossier that you have to submit to WOA. Quads countries did a lot of modeling initially on, and we looked at about 1,000 iterations using a stamping out policy, okay? And what we got was a wide variation in the model responses, anywhere from very, very few outbreaks to massive outbreaks here. And this modeling was done using 5 different models, UK model, Exodus, OSVET, Interspread Plus, and NASDM. And when the group superimposed vaccination, we saw basically a flattening of the curve. And we were talking about flattening of the curve long before Theresa Tam did. Okay? But you can see that it probably doesn't help in small outbreaks. But in large outbreaks, it just prevents them from getting very, very large. So then we began to ask, how can we predict which outbreaks are going to be large? You know, and as time goes by, your accuracy of prediction gets better and better because, you know, it's already large now. So, but what we wanted to know was, could we predict it at 7 to 10 days? And we found 3 factors that were associated with large outbreaks. 1, high density of susceptible species, a large geographic spread in the first 7 to 10 days, and a large number of infected premise in the first 7 to 10 days. All those things in common look at basically delays to depopulation, because it's going to take a large number of resources to get those animals done in. So delays to depopulation was a common factor in the large outbreaks, as we saw in Japan. And this has led to our current thinking at CFI that if this occurs in high-density areas such as Feedlot Alley in Alberta, we're going to have to vaccinate. Vaccination by the world is not always been looked upon favorably due to issues early on in producing vaccines. Some of the early vaccines produced were originally extracted from the tongues of animals kept only for that purpose. As well as there were inactivation issues early on, incomplete activation, and so the vaccines actually caused some disease. Another issue is with Brian stated is the carrier state in cattle, where the virus can be recovered for up to 3 years from either vaccinated or non-vaccinated animals. And it has led to, while we're not sure that this is capable of being transmitted in cattle, there is some older literature that indicates it might be. But in the lab, I don't think, Brian, they've ever been able to reproduce those situations except in the African buffalo. So preventive vaccination coupled with stamping out of cases was adopted by most European countries in the 50s on a voluntary basis, but you really couldn't ship cattle to a slaughterhouse if they weren't vaccinated. In 1986, a country would have to provide proof that there had been no outbreaks of FMD in the past 36 months, 3 years, in order to be approved as FMD-free without vaccination. Contrarily, if a country had a compulsory vaccination program, freedom could be obtained in 2 years after the last case. By the late 80s, FMD appeared to have been eradicated in the EU, and as a consequence, in 1992, the EU adopted a non-vaccination policy in order to guarantee trade between the EU and other FMD-free without vaccination countries. And to reflect on the EU influence on WOA, this resulted in changes to the FMD chapter. So there was a new chapter adopted in 1992. It allowed a country to be declared FMD-free if no outbreak or vaccination had occurred in the last 12 months. They also changed the incubation period from 21 days to 14 days, which is what it currently is in the code. And it introduced an accelerated period for the recovery of status for free countries experiencing outbreaks, but did not mention the use of vaccination. And so the recovery of status had one pathway to recover, and it was 6 months after the last case where stamping out and serological surveillance had been conducted. With the signing of the 1995 WTO Sanitary Phytosanitary Agreement, WOA is recognized as the standard-setting organization for trade in animals and animal products. In 95, again, WOA created, and if maybe I'm confusing people, so WOA is the new acronym for the OIE. And this just changed recently, and I will sometimes mix the two up because I'm so used to talking about OIE, but we have to say WOA now. They created a list of FMD-free countries and followed that by the publication of that list in the following year. In 1997, WOA began to require that countries had to reconfirm their FMD status by submitting documentations to WOA every November. And if you don't submit that documentation, you are classified as an infected country. There was another revision in 1998. The concept of using emergency vaccination was included to control an outbreak. That's when it was first introduced, and so the recovery of status now had two pathways. The first one, 3 months after the last case where stamping out and serological surveillance had applied, you would need to submit the dossier to WOA for their approval, or 3 months after the slaughter of the last vaccinated animal. So you can see that even if you used emergency vaccination, you had to kill them all. And if you didn't, then you fell into that category of starting from scratch. And FMD-free countries where vaccination is not practiced, you would have to send a declaration to WOA that there had been no outbreak of FMD, and no vaccination had been carried out in the last 12 months. And these were the rules that the UK had to follow in 2001. So in the FMD outbreak that occurred in the United Kingdom in 2001, I'll just reiterate, 4 million animals and 10,157 premises, and I think I got those numbers the same as Gordon, but I'm not sure. Further, 2.5 million animals were slaughtered for welfare reasons, and some of the numbers that I've seen calculate the number as high as 10 million animals were disposed of. In the Netherlands in 2001, approximately 260,000 animals were killed to eradicate FMD. 186,000 of those were vaccinated animals that were subsequently destroyed in order to recover their freedom at 3 months. And I think some of the literature I've seen details that it would have cost them, Netherlands, 7 times as much if they had waited and recovered their freedom at 6 months. The political repercussions of those outbreaks in the UK and the Netherlands led to convening of a meeting in Brussels in 2001. Both countries made it clear that the extensive slaughter that had occurred to control FMD was no longer acceptable, and alternative policies were needed. The meeting called for greater flexibility in control options for member states and to manage future FMD outbreaks, and including emergency vaccination as a tool to reduce the number of animals destroyed. So there was a new code came out after that meeting in 2002, and now we've got 3 pathways for recovery of status. Okay, A and B didn't change, but they added 6 months after the last case of, or the last vaccination, where stamping out policy, emergency vaccination, and serological surveillance to show that there were no, based on the detection of non-structural proteins of FMD, to demonstrate absence of infection. And this is critical here, absence of infection, because WOA considers anything carrying antibodies to the actual circulating virus to be infected. Okay, so all those animals that were exposed and then vaccinated would have to be destroyed. And this article is still in place today. With the outbreaks in 2010, 2011, in Korea and Japan, both countries had a WOA status of FMD-free without vaccination. It rekindled the international discussion on the role of vaccination for FMD. In the Korean outbreak, they deferred the decision to vaccinate because of the trade implications. And more than 3 million animals were killed in a short period of time. And very, very serious animal welfare issues, a lot of discussion about animals being buried alive, and environmental issues at the burial sites because of the fact that the animals were alive and these pits were lined with plastic. They perforated the plastic and caused a lot of water damage. And there was a lot of remedial work that had to be done later on. Japan culled 290,000 animals, of which 126,000 were healthy vaccinates, in order to regain their WOA FMD-free status in 3 months rather than wait for the 6 month. And so clearly the changes that were made in the 2002 code revisions were insufficient to affect real change in the FMD situation, recovery of status. So part of the work that the Quads FMD or Quads CBOs had done, they did task Dr. Dorothy Giel with looking at the situation of the waiting periods and trying to harmonize them. And they drafted a paper which they presented to WOA outlining the fact that the waiting periods were really arbitrary. And the 3-month waiting period, well, they thought that 6 months would double that, and so there was really no scientific basis behind those waiting periods. And they wrote that they felt that the decision on recovery of freedom should be based on scientific evidence rather than just arbitrary waiting periods. And the WOA commissions agreed and attempted to draft requirements in the code for Vaccinate to Live. And basically what is in yellow here is the way WOA identifies changes to the code. What I have outlined in red is they still have included absence of infection. And this article, if you wanted to recover freedom in 3 months, you would have to sample all vaccinated ruminants and their non-vaccinated offspring, as well as a representative number of other species based on acceptable levels of confidence. And so it really was a huge task. You know, you probably couldn't get that done in 3 months. But even still, several member countries opposed, for different reasons, the new text, which proposed conditions for reducing the 6-month waiting period to 3 months. And the Commission subsequently withdrew those clauses, giving the opposition member countries that had recently experienced those outbreaks. The Code Commission recommended that they be examined further by experts to explore how to address this issue. In 2015, the Quads group, I drafted a paper, Harpreet Koshar, Dr. Koshar sent me to Australia. I had presented them a proposal, and we drafted together an additional white paper on a revised containment zone and additional rationale for harmonization of waiting periods. That resulted in FMD ad hoc commissions being formed in 2016, 17, and 18, which I was invited to participate in. We discussed zoning in 2016 and surveillance for waiting periods in 2017 and 2018. And we revised the concept of containment zone as well as the protection zone, giving countries much needed tools to deal with an outbreak. And the revised containment zone consists of 2 zones, an inner zone and an outer zone, where no outbreaks have occurred for the outer zone where no outbreaks have occurred for at least 2 incubation periods. The inner zone will have to contain all the cases that have occurred. And so it's basically this. And once we have submitted that to the Scientific Commission at WOA, they will either approve it or not approve it. If they approve it, the area outside of that containment zone is, the status is reinstated and trade can begin again. The problem with this is that you're only allowed 1 shot at this, and also you're only allowed 1 containment zone. So all cases have to be that are epi-linked have to be within this inner circle. So we have made comments or sent comments to WOA indicating that we don't believe that only an epi-link is required, but if we have long-distance movements, such as we do in Canada, we may end up with 2 foci of infection, and therefore, if we provide scientific evidence that we have 2 areas of infection, we should be able to have 2 containment zones. It should be based on evidence, just not the epi-link. Finally, this is the chapter that was put up for adoption in May of 2023, which was subsequently withdrawn due to some EU objections to allowing vaccinated animals into their countries. So hopefully this will go before the Commission or for the World Assembly in May of 2024. But it contains a lot of the things that we think we need. We still have 6 months, but now we can recover freedom in 3 months if we can demonstrate no transmission of FMD. And this is key because that's a lot easier to prove than absence of infection. So we can submit sufficient evidence demonstrating absence of infection in the non-vaccinated population and absence of transmission in the emergency vaccinated population, according to articles covered in the surveillance section. One of the things that this is contingent on in the surveillance section, though, is we have to answer the relative questionnaire that's contained in Chapter 111 of the Code, demonstrating compliance with either A or B and C. in areas where emergency vaccination has been deployed. So A requires all vaccinates tested as well as their offspring, and that's really only useful where very, very small numbers have been vaccinated. So in our cases, it's probably not going to be useful. But in B part, we've convinced them that random serological surveillance in vaccinated herds can be risk stratified, so we don't have to test every animal. We can test a subset of the vaccinated animals to show that there's been no transmission. And in the unvaccinated population, we would still have to do surveillance of 1% at the herd level and 5% within herd prevalence. But we also have to show vaccine efficacy. So we have to show that good match between the vaccine and the virus. We have to show effectiveness of our vaccination program. In other words, that the cows responded and gave us good antibody levels. And the vaccine has to be at least 6 PD50 or 6 times the protective dose of 50%. So these are that's a high potency. Normal commercial vaccines that are used around the world are often about 3 PD50. And so we have to demonstrate in our submission to WOA. Finally, one of the things that we're looking at, and one of the comments that we made to WOA, was that slaughterhouses are a big problem. Abattoirs are a big problem, in that they could be impacted in one of these containment zones and not allowed to ship meat anywhere. But slaughter plants are really a dead end, and once they're cleaned and disinfected, they should be capable of bringing animals in from free zones and exporting that product, as long as it's done under certain rules and regulations. Basically, identifying those slaughter plants as compartments, and they should be able to ship meat. So we'll see that will go before the Scientific Commission in September, and we should see a report coming out in October, November. And we'll have a look at that and see if we can affect some change. Thank you for your attention. Any questions? Well, I guess questions will be later.